Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to panel 11, in what ways can diasporic engagement in civil society and civic space unsettle development? My name's Sarah Peck. I'm a research fellow at Northumbria University, and I'm co-convening this panel with Jen Dickinson from Winchester University. And today we are really excited to have three presentations, all of which I'm very much looking forward to, that speak to the intersections between diasporic communities, civil society and global development. Firstly from Tigist Grieve, secondly from Olewola Ugumpemau and Abiola Olajide, and finally from Jen Dickinson. And this will be followed with some reflections from our discussant, Kalpana Wilson, and we'll end with the question and answer session and a wider discussion. So just some housekeeping to start with. If we can try and keep our microphones on mute while presenters are speaking, and then please do feel free to turn your videos on and microphones on once we're onto the question and answer session. This session is also being recorded for other conference delegates. And if you have any questions or comments at any point during the session, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I think in the Zoom chat rather than the Hoover chat, and we'll try and pick them up at a later point during the session. Right then, shall we get started then with our presentation? So our first presentation is from Tigist Grieve. Tigist is a Senior Research Associate and ESRC GCRF Fellow based at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Bristol in the UK. And today she's going to be talking about diaspora unleashing its potential as a force for good change. So over to you, Tigist.
Thank you so much. First, just a very minor correction on my SRC projects ended. So I'm a Senior Research Associate at Bristol University, like you said. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to engaging with this topic, and thanks for setting it up. And my aim in the next few minutes is just to throw a couple of questions and stimulate discussions rather than from any empirical kind of research. So when we are talking about the diaspora, I just wanted to say there, just to highlight to you that it is a very contested concept. Who gets to be a diaspora? What shapes the diaspora? And an idea around who is a migrant, who is a diaspora, what sort of experiences are, or what sort of pathways they came to being, is positioning them to be a diaspora. And when does that happen? Often these are debates in the migration studies, which is not really my area, but this is just to put forward there are a lot of debates going on in there, including typologies and criteria, and how we recognize diaspora as a concept, but also recognition that it's not a homogeneous community when migrants are living abroad, and they, in the way they envisage themselves as diaspora or not. Generally, the narrative about people leaving their country and living outside is looked at as a brain drain, as a knowledge transfer from time to time, being at an advantage as an insider as well as an outsider. But also there is an increasing kind of debate coming around where aid and development can be, donors can frame it in the best interest of their country or their politics, their interests. The diaspora can have the best interest of the home country in the heart. That's one of the areas people are talking about as well in this debate. Of course, it's not all a rosy picture in terms of positioning diaspora back home. There is a discussion around a threat to traditional way of being, how their in a conservative culture in particular, whether it is about appearance and dressing up, or mannerisms and behavior and engagement with communities and respect to tradition, there is kind of concern as well that we must also acknowledge that shapes that community. Like I said, because it is not about empirical evidence, but anecdotal stuff I wanted to share with you today is how the diasporas in the UK, in the US, in Europe, as well as some extent in the Middle East, are engaging with back home with their communities in terms of development related engagements and trying to bring good change. I put the question mark there deliberately because change can happen, but not necessarily always a good change. And this is really a phrase from Robert Chambers' ideas about good change. So some of the examples we could raise or connect to international development, for example, is how the diasporas tend to build on local tradition or informal ideas. For example, development has repackaged some very old idea in the global south as microfinance. And we do know and we do read a lot about microfinance now, but it did exist. And a form of microfinance did exist in many at least in African countries. And the other thing I wanted to highlight there is diaspora raising funds on the ground, not just abroad where they are in the US or in Europe or the UK, but back home as well. There are a lot of activity in their own homeland, going and raising funds to bring some good change. So opening new universities in various countries like in Somalia, in Ethiopia, hospitals, new services, especially digital and technology related innovations are happening in many of the African countries. And there are also a diaspora engagement, not just back home and an individual diaspora community, but within across different communities. So the Ethiopians, for example, living in the UK are collaborating with those living in the US to bring that sort of stuff. So one thing I could summarize kind of my argument would be there is a potential for diaspora to be used more in the global development space, and I would argue that it is so far underutilized. So the example I'm trying to make how it's not just about connection between or relationship between here and back home, but this is, for example, what I put in front of you is when COVID hit, it is something that myself and other people in the Ethiopian community, both in the UK and in the US, come together to support the Ministry of Health in Ethiopia. So this is medics based in the US, medics based in the UK that are of Ethiopian origin, and people like myself, particularly those who live in the southwest, the UK, being together and sending out this kind of really essential things, because when COVID hit, Ethiopia didn't really have many oxygen concentrators and things. So there was direct channel between Ministry of Health, facilitated through the embassy, facilitated through network, the medical network abroad, to kind of bypass those bureaucracies which otherwise would have been hindering this kind of initiatives. So in this key example, the fund was being raised here or in the US, but we were also collaborating with the embassies, both in London in the US and in China, because it was being imported from China. So it was really interesting to see how fast things were happening, how less conditional it was in terms of the thinking behind it. Often, as you know, aid and development kind of support comes attached with lots and lots of baggages, and perhaps maybe more accountable as well, because they were directly, all eyes were on these goodies arriving back home and being utilized at such urgent time. Another example I want to bring is around accountability, increased accountability, and gatekeeper, the diaspora being a gatekeeper now, those who are living abroad. So this is around critiquing some of the statements that may be coming out from academia or others. And this is an example I put there on Twitter. Africa is not a football for your clickbaits or for you to stay relevant. So there any questioning or there any inappropriate kind of statements or claims being made in the past may have not been questioned, but now there is a community that would question. Actually, this was around a recent book being published around, about Somalia, and people questioning that, which was really interesting and new kind of development. The other thing I wanted to also say, there's the diaspora community are making kind of impact back home as well. So this is from recent research we've done last summer in various countries around adolescent girls' voices. And in our research in Somalia, a lot of the data, there was a mentioning of Ilhan Omar, the politician in the US, as a role model for girls and their aspiration to become like her. So diasporas, even though they are not physically there, or they're not necessarily engaged in directly with development, there is a still role that seem to be happening for them in there. The other thing I was really trying to open up for us to discuss here is what are the potential for diaspora in terms of unsettling development, as a DSA conference is trying to engage with unsettling development. For example, I just put there is a critique around how experts are parachuted to solve problems in the blueprint of development happening in various ways, and the inappropriateness of that, and how does that sit when the cases maybe with the diaspora community working in those sector, in that space, and to what extent also the diaspora engagement and contribution address the problematic around development, for example, the current critique around white savior mentality, or the culture of the sector in terms of racism in the culture and the way we look at communities in deficit lens. How would that unsettle, that sort of issues. And finally, I thought it would be good also to talk around the decolonization idea of in development, where aid may have been quite dominant in the past. The diaspora community tend to go and invest, like I mentioned earlier, in universities or in establishing hospitals and those kind of things. So I'm finished really with my bit, and this was interesting quote I got: don't get swallowed up by a foreign country, never remember where it came from, do something however small. I leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tigis. That was fantastic. And those really interesting, those questions at the end, I think really spoke to some of the conversations that we'd like to have today. So that's fantastic. And I think also bringing about, or sort of starting to discuss kind of accountability and accountability and holding, you know, sort of the potential for diasporic communities to hold other development actors to account and their role within that, and also accountability that maybe diasporic organisations have a kind of negotiate that accountability with maybe some of the communities that they want to work with, are both really interesting things to think about as well. So thank you, that was absolutely fantastic. That was lovely. I was just thinking, Ola, would it be worth maybe Jen going next, and that gives us a little bit more time for Abiola to join us? I don't know if that would be okay with you both.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine with me. Let's give him some minutes to join us.
Yeah, okay. So we'll move on to Jen. So Jen, as I said before, is co-convening this panel with me today. She's a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Winchester, and today she's going to talk about transnational mobilisation for the second generation. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you. Can you see that presentation?
Yeah, that's all fine.
Excellent. All right. So it's so great to have you all here, and thank you as well, Tigis, for opening up these questions. And some of these I kind of hope to pick up on both in this presentation, but also in the discussion as well. So just to give you some context for the research, this is a very new piece of research that I've been conducting since 2019, towards the end of 2019. It's of course been seriously affected by the pandemic, so this really is just, you know, what I'm presenting here is some kind of really early stages of thinking that's emerging from this project. So the research project itself set out to examine how peer learning partnerships between young people, young Rwandans in the diaspora in the UK and young people in Rwanda could work together to develop initiatives that create equitable forms of diaspora engagement within development initiatives. So this is a piece of research that kind of arose from a concern about sometimes what we see is some of the increasing inequalities being perpetuated by diaspora engagement in development. And it's something that is seen in many contexts. And it's particularly seen in Rwanda because of the ways in which much of the Rwandan state in particular is comprised of people from the diaspora and returnees from the diaspora. So there's a kind of emerging kind of divide between sort of Rwandans born in Rwanda and then Rwandans who've returned from the diaspora in the ways in which the economy, particularly the urban economy, is being organized. So this project was looking at how young people could work together between the UK and Rwanda in order to develop initiatives that are based on mutual trust and mutual respect to try to facilitate different ways of working together. And what kind of has started to emerge over the course of this research, and I'm going to reflect on this aspect very specifically, which is the role of kind of national development narratives and national development stories, and the ways in which those articulate people in the diaspora's own identities and concerns and aspirations about themselves as second generation diaspora, but also minority Black youth positioned in the UK, where they're subject to ongoing racialization in various kinds of spaces. So one of the questions that became very interesting to me was how these kind of national development narratives function within the identities and aspirations of these young people. So what we looked at was, well, one of the aspects I'm going to reflect on is how these kind of work to kind of mobilize young second generation youth for development. So what do these kind of national stories do? How can they function in terms of building identity, but also as a sort of prerequisite to more material modes of political and economic mobilization? And I want to talk about national narratives, primarily because of the ways in which they're really important vectors of transmitting knowledge about national development objectives and values. When researchers of the second generation and the youth diaspora have looked at these national development narratives, they tend to look at them through the lens of the state and how the state frames it, which means that there isn't much yet about how that knowledge travels and like what young people do with that knowledge. How does it travel across different kinds of sites and spaces? How is it linked not only to the nationalist agendas of the home and the homeland state, but also to the kind of, you know, the realities of second generation youth diaspora in their kind of everyday lives within these kinds of racialized spaces in which they live. So the argument that I want to make is that, you know, despite the ways in which these national development narratives, by their very nature, are very partial and subject to a lot of contestation, there are aspects of these stories that really resonate with second generation young people in terms of their sort of hybrid identities. And I think they're really important for offering grounds for their mobilization in service of various kinds of development objective, but also in repositioning and understanding their own identities within the context of the UK. So going back to the first presentation, which was talking about this idea of enabling good change, I see that kind of change, that kind of knowledge flows as sort of not just something that travels in one direction, but it can also travel in both directions as well. So not just sort of from the diaspora to the home community, but also from the homeland to the diaspora in ways that can be like really useful and really relevant for young people. So just to tell you a bit about the methodology. So this is, we used a participatory methodology. And what we did, and we managed to do this just before the national lockdown, thankfully, we were very, very lucky, is to have got most of the main bulk of this work done in sort of January 2020. So what we did was bring 10 British-born Rwandans, young between the ages of 18 and 25 to the UK, to Rwanda, to work with between 5 and 10 young people in Rwanda. And the goal really was to bring these two groups of people together to talk about you know, what kind of things were relevant to them, how they could work together to build various kinds of diaspora initiatives and get them kind of involved in these kind of, you know, some kind of making a contribution to their home countries. And one of the kind of interesting things which was emerging was that many of these young people had within their families, within their communities, were constantly being told that they needed to make a contribution, but no one ever really told them how to do that. So one of the things that we wanted to do was kind of find these kind of more experimental spaces for them to be able to do it in a way that like made sense to them and made sense to their lives in a way that was meaningful to them. So it consisted of 5 phases. The first phase, we recruited 10 British Rwandan participants to come on our visit to Rwanda, our visit to learn more about the history of Rwanda, how they could contribute to Rwanda through their kind of the kind of knowledges that they possessed. In the second phase, the selected participants spent a month, 2 months doing wider research in their community in the UK to learn about sort of family knowledge, family histories, understandings of Rwanda. The third phase was a visit. So that was a 10-day visit in which we brought them to these kind of to the Aegis Trust and their headquarters in Rwanda to, you know, to learn about Rwandan history, to learn about how the government had been reconstructing Rwanda after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and to learn about various development problems and issues that they could get involved with. And then the fourth phase of the study was a follow-up period where the participants in the UK would work together with the participants in Rwanda, developing their own sort of citizen initiatives once they returned back to the UK. And then the fifth phase, which is where we are now, is in the follow-up stage. So kind of, doing some work thinking about how their participation in the project had worked, and what went well and what didn't, and how they worked together with their peers in Rwanda. So we're kind of, in terms of the disruption of the pandemic, we came back right at the end of the study visit. So this was in February. So between February last year and this time period, they've been working on developing these citizen initiatives in Rwanda together with their peers. So that's kind of where they are now with it. And we've been kind of doing some follow-up interviews along with it. But the specific thing that I'd like to reflect on within this presentation is what these kind of learning spaces can do. So the theoretical framework that we were working with is thinking about the idea of a liberatory pedagogy. And the idea of a liberatory pedagogy is based on the work of Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks, who kind of, Freire in particular, contended that education could be a source of liberation when knowledge is posed as a dialogue that enables learners to develop a critical consciousness in order to then be able to move past the structures generated by the dominant culture and the dominant system of social relations. And building on this, the feminist and social activist Bell Hooks take these ideas further and argues that pedagogy should be a form of political activism where teaching enables transgressions of movement against and beyond boundaries, teaching as a practice of freedom. So the key hallmarks of a liberatory pedagogy is that it infuses hope into the learning processes and also infuses possibilities for collective social transformation. So for both Freire and Hooks, they really center the importance of political self-education and critical consciousness, which is central to understanding how oppressed people can obtain a more meaningful form of liberation. And this framework is usually applied within formal education settings, so primarily in universities, although Bell Hooks sees liberatory education as located within these wider communities of practice and wider communities of resistance. So one of the things we're interested in is to what extent does learning and these active learning processes, both with and also about Rwanda's developmental narrative, create a liberatory pedagogy for the second generation in diaspora? What does this actually do for them? And the context for all of this is the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Rwanda is a country that is marked by a very violent and a very traumatic past, with the devastating 1994 genocide taking up to 1 million Rwandan and particularly Rwandan Tutsi lives. Now, this has casted a very long shadow over the ways in which Rwanda's development trajectory is discussed in public, but also in private as well. And there's also a very prominent official history of the causes, but also the responses to the genocide, which is very widely disseminated in various kinds of civic spaces and in Rwanda, but also in the diaspora. And like any historical narrative that endorses a national collective memory and a national collective story, it's a very complex story and it contains multiple contested elements. However, there is a story and it's always kind of presented officially quite simply, which is that the kind of officially sanctioned narrative is that pre-colonial Rwanda was a unified and harmonious society characterized by peaceful relations. This was disrupted by German and then Belgian colonial administration and the Catholic Church, who disrupted this idyllic state in the 1900s when they imposed the ethnic distinctions of the Tutsi, the Hutu, and the Twa. And that over time became racialized through various kind of official colonial projects, culminating in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And the kind of next kind of part of the story is that these structures were then dismantled by the governing party, who's still in power, after the 1994 Liberation War. Who then later consolidated this work to erase that ethnicity through the various projects, the National Unity and Reconciliation Body, under an ideology of what's called the D Rwanda, so one Rwanda. And then the kind of final part of this liberation story was the introduction in 2000 of Vision 2020 and Vision 2030, with the aim of Rwanda becoming a knowledge-based middle-income country. And underpinning this is a real ideology of what's called agaciro, which is a sort of national ideology loosely translated as self-worth or dignity, which is then designed to liberate the country from its neo-colonial dependencies on aid. And so the diaspora are a really important part of this story because of the ways in which they form part of this reclamation of Rwanda as an anti-colonial state that is eventually becoming free from aid. And so what we can see in this is it's a very anti-colonial story, but it's also the ways in which the 1994 genocide weighs very heavily on the present, in the politics around how this story comes to be, how it was ended, how the RPF government liberated the country from these colonially imposed structures, and then to how then the work of the RPF has enabled Rwanda to recover to become a very forward-looking vision of modernity, in which Rwanda is a donor darling amongst the international community. And this is kind of very sharply related to how they enroll the diaspora, because the diaspora are those that contribute to this narrative of freeing Rwanda from the sort of colonial structures of aid. So what I want to do is just kind of say a little bit about how this affects the young people who were learning about this story during our visit. So the main part of our research involved a 10-day stay in Rwanda with participants learning about this history, obviously kind of presented through this very, this narrative, this official narrative of, you know, the colonization, then the genocide, and then the rebuilding and the recovery, and the ways in which the diaspora were effectively part of that story. And so this visit kind of progressed through increasingly interactive engagements with this history, using an exploration of participants' own community histories outside. And this was both the diaspora who were participating in this, but also the young people in Rwanda as well. So most of the topics within this learning process primarily covered what we could call a sort of development of a critical consciousness. And in the liberatory pedagogy literature, critical consciousness is defined as an awareness and understanding of the socio-political structures and issues that are shaped by coloniality, including the epistemic violences and the experiences of Black people worldwide, stemming back from these colonial structures. And so the response amongst the diaspora was that they were able to understand this colonial history that had shaped both their family histories and also their own experiences, but then also how they were positioned within British society as well. So this includes the kind of ways in which these spaces acted to enable them to critically question their own family histories, which had previously been silent. So there was always not always, there tends to be a little bit of a culture of silence around the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi because of these kind of historical dynamics. But these kind of spaces allowed these young people to trace what had happened to their family back to these colonial structures. It enabled them to understand how the genocide was possible and how it was connected to the dehumanization of the Tutsi by the Hutu nationalists. But then they were able to link this as well to their own experiences of being minority communities in the UK. The other aspect that was very important and the aspect of the liberatory pedagogy was that it was about understanding the particular stories and the individual stories and the individual testimonies, which was really quite profound for these young people, particularly the ways in which many of them would then go on to reflect what their family members had been through, and then being able to question, you know, their own kind of position within British society and how they need these kind of humanizing stories in order to be able to overcome and transcend many of the racializing experiences that they've been subject to. So there was a kind of sense of being able to kind of understand in a very effective sense, in a very moving sense, how the genocide was possible, for them to then also be able to understand the steps that needed to be taken for both this to be prevented in the future, but also to understand how these kind of racializing processes happen. A third important feature of the liberatory pedagogy that we saw in these kind of spaces was an acknowledgement of the emotionality that accompanies the learning processes, and in particular the opportunities that they had to experience the interpersonal connections, not only with each other and to learn from each other about their own families and their own family history and their own experiences, but also to learn with other young people in Rwanda who'd also were also survivors of the 1994 genocide. So then they were able to connect to each other, but also to their families, to their other family members in Rwanda who they'd only ever kind of not really kind of fully understood what had exactly happened to them. So they became much more aware of the significance of any kind of potential developmental contributions that they might want to make. It also allowed them to make connections to their parents back in the diaspora as well. So, they'd then be able to kind of think about, for instance, their parents and the kind of struggles that they went through as they were the first generation in the UK. So that then made them able to kind of much more easily think about the kind of issues that might then go on to affect people back in Rwanda. And then the final feature, and I'm drawing to a conclusion, the final feature of the liberatory pedagogy that we saw of this Rwandan story was that it allowed participants to cultivate conditions both within and beyond the classroom that affirmed and sustained and further empowered their own ways of knowing and being and doing as Rwandans, both in the UK, but also opening to potential futures in Rwanda as well. So, the ways in which they might, for instance, apply their knowledge to addressing contemporary challenges in Rwanda. And again, the liberatory pedagogy kind of theory argues that these kind of ways of knowing can affirm students' identity and encourage learners to share who they authentically are. And what we found was that engaging with these learning experiences for these young people provided a much more rounded and more complete picture of who they were or who they are, but also helping them to think ahead to the kinds of skills and cultural competencies that they had, which then enabled them to be well positioned for the future, both in the UK, but then also perhaps in Rwanda, whilst also creating space for aspirations, both for themselves, but then also for their homeland. So I'm going to just end really by just kind of thinking about some implications. So, first and foremost, these kind of education spaces that are provided by organisations like the Aegis Trust, they're organisations that exist beyond the state that can participate in mechanisms through which diasporas can become mobilised through these much more emotional resonances and some of these emotional affects and emotional geographies. The second, I think it's useful to consider under what conditions these kind of historical articulations speak to their ideas as it relates to specific national and global contexts and particular kind of moments. And one of the interesting things about our visit was that it coincided, the end of the visit coincided with the pandemic, but also the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, which was then starting to shape how they felt about Rwanda. They became much more proud of it. They became wanting to shout about the achievements of Rwanda. They were much more proud to express their Rwandan identity within British public spaces. And this was being kind of conditioned by these Black Lives Matter discourses and debates. And so that was really important for kind of positioning themselves and kind of thinking about their own voices in these processes. So thank you so much for listening. And
Thanks very much, Jen. That was great. So much packed in there that I was just trying to scribble different things down. I think really interesting questions around kind of sort of the generational aspects of diasporic engagement, how knowledge can travel through different generations, and I guess loads of stuff around how the young British Rwandan diaspora that you spoke about, how they came to understand the racialized experiences and struggles for themselves within British society as well, which I think is would be really key to touch on in our discussions, and the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And I think for me, kind of interesting ideas about whether there's it'd be interesting to hear more from you about whether there was any space for kind of contesting that sort of that dominant narrative of development that was being projected through the Rwandan state and obviously civic space as well. Yeah, so thank you, that's great. I know this is sort of slightly the wrong, or sort of slightly out of sync, but I wondered if you wanted to, Kalpana, whether you would like to just give a few short reflections on the two presentations that we've heard so far.
Yeah, I could just do that briefly because I think we probably get Olawola's slides quite.
Okay, thank you. I have your email address now. I will send it to you.
So yeah, I mean, really interesting questions raised so far by both Tigis and also Jen. And you know, I really liked you know, some of the points which you made initially about like the sort of homogeneity of the diaspora and how that actually affects who really considers themselves diaspora, and also I think who gets counted as diaspora by the home country as well. And I think that's something to maybe think about. I think you know, I also liked your point about repackaging previous ideas, you know, like which, you know, of course, microfinance being the classic example where there's so many practices in Africa, also in Asia, and so on, which you know have been appropriated. We were talking in another panel about the way they've also been made much more kind of hierarchical and segmented than they originally were. And I kind of wonder whether we can also see some of the diaspora engagement in development as it's now understood in that way, because it was actually already happening in ones which are not being understood as development. And now they're being kind of, you know, recognized and incorporated. I mean, you also talked about the fact that, you know, in the case of Ethiopia, that there's quite important links being made between diasporas in different places. And I think, again, that kind of brings us back to the whole question of difference within the diaspora and the kind of the context of the diaspora as well. Which I'll talk a little bit more about when I probably do a bit at the end of all the papers. But I suppose just thinking about, you know, for example, how is the diaspora different in the US to the UK? I mean, does it have a different history? Have they migrated at different times? Have they been, you know, different immigration regimes affected who can migrate? What kind, you know, what their class position is, what kind of mobility they've had, and that kind of thing. So I suppose that was something which I just thought would be very interesting to think about more. And then, you know, the point you made obviously about kind of the potential which when diasporas are involved in this way, is there this potential to kind of escape the colonial logic, you know, escape those hierarchies that it said. And I think that's, you know, it's both exciting as well as, you know, one has to approach it cautiously in the sense that I think at times one can see those logics being reproduced even in the relationship between the diaspora and the so-called homeland, you know, and certainly in the way the diasporas are seen now as being such a kind of, you know, the great hope for development and this sort of almost idealized way, often includes this idea that they, you know, a kind of civilizational idea that they've been in the West, they've, you know, got all these, you know, good ideas of how to do things through being in the West. And then they've, you know, they'll be able to take those back. And I see that a lot, particularly because I work on gender around this whole idea that, you know, diasporic women, women's organizations and so on are very good conduit for, you know, supposedly like, you know, better ways of thinking about gender and so on. It kind of fits in with the idea that gender equality is something located only in the global south and not here. But yeah, so those are kind of some of my thoughts, and that kind of, Jen, I really liked the fact that you, you know, reversed that whole question, that whole, you know, looking at the reverse flows of knowledge was something that I found really, really interesting in your paper. And also, of course, the importance of the second generation, which is the kind of, one of the very big questions around all of this, isn't it? And so you're kind of looking at it in those two very, very different ways. I think, and also the whole focus on how that might impact on experiences of racialization and racism and that whole question. So I think I'll kind of maybe leave it there, because that links into some broader points which I wanted to make, and I'd like to hear Alawala first. I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. Just that short intervention. How are you doing, Olewole? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm fine. I'm ready. I've sent the PowerPoint. Okay.
Okay, that's great.
And I haven't received the PowerPoint yet.
Okay.
I keep looking at my emails, but it's not there yet.
Okay.
Have you received it?
No, not yet. Sorry.
Is
it a big file?
Yes.
Okay, so it could take a little if it's a big file. I'll keep looking. I'll let you know immediately.
I feel we need some sort of holding music, don't we? That you hear when you're waiting on the phone for someone.
Sarah, I don't know if Tigis wants to respond to any of those comments. Certainly, while we wait, I'd be happy to respond to some of the comments that Kalpana has raised, if that's all right with you, Tigis.
Yeah, that's fine. But stop us as soon as that PowerPoint arrives, so there is enough time for you to present. Yeah, Jen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I really found those comments really useful, particularly, but also I was thinking quite a lot as well about some of the things that Tigis raised as well, particularly where you were talking about how many of the people in the anecdotes that you shared, in which Twitter is being used as a space to hold people and academics to account about the history of those of the homeland, and it's certainly something I've observed as well. So going back to this question about knowledge flow, one of the things that I've been observed is the ways in which those official narratives and those histories are also being used to hold Western experts on Rwanda to account, and Rwanda is very similar, I think, in that there is a very contested history. There's a very divided diaspora. There's also a divided academic community, and I've seen on Twitter that these kind of histories then become repurposed to question what white Western experts are saying about Rwanda, and this was also demonstrated with the publication of a recent book by Michelle Arong on the regime of Paul Kagame, and these kind of histories were very useful for diasporas and diaspora communities to be rebutting some of the claims that were being made by these experts around Rwanda's history. And I kind of feel like it's really a significant moment, because in within the diaspora, there's been this resurgence of genocide denial, and these kind of histories are being used, but not just amongst the diaspora, but also amongst sort of certain journalists and certain experts as well. So I find it quite useful kind of thinking about how these kind of spaces function against some of these kind of processes.
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed some of the ideas you brought in terms of the different challenges, like you talked about collective social transformation. That's what I was trying to allude to when I said, is there something to be unleashed about the diaspora? And there is the claim that they have the home at heart rather than the politics or than the best, the donors. objectives perhaps would be different from the diaspora objectives. And it'd be interesting thing to explore there in terms of that, because they do understand the nuance, like about that relationship with the contested areas you just mentioned around, not everybody agrees in the diaspora how, the political narratives or the official narratives or the opposition narratives. And the insider-outsider advantage is that they will have a bit more knowledge. Whether they use that for good or evil is something else, but there is that knowledge they have, within which then they can hold people to account, as you just mentioned. Another thing that was emerging for me as I was working through this, and also experiencing that, because I'm part and parcel of that, the diaspora community, there are lots of initiatives that are happening. So the Renaissance Dome in Ethiopia at the moment is a massive issue and geopolitical issue as well. Is supported and funded by the nation itself. So there is some, if there is any continuity, there is a continuity between different regimes in Ethiopia, from the King Haile Selassie to the EPRDF, the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, and then the current government as well, a drive to make that kind of development in their own terms, from their own resources, because of the lack of space for that aid, development aid, to come from that kind of projects, mega projects, aspirational projects people have or countries have. And the diaspora had been really key partner for this project to take off from the ground in terms of contributing. Of course, it's not just the diaspora. Communities in Ethiopia have contributed for many years now to that purse, from little salaries and little money they have, farmers, everyone contributed to that. But the diaspora are important in that space. So much so, I think there is a named diaspora roundabout in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia. So it also shows you how the government is trying to take hold of that kind of potential support that the diaspora could bring. Okay, are we ready with I don't want to take too much time. I'm really conscious about your presentation.
Yeah, that looks great. So I'll just introduce you. So our final presentation is from Olewola Ogunpamo, and unfortunately Abiola Jide wasn't able to join us today, but they're researchers from the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, and you're going to be talking about the roles of the Nigerian diaspora in potentially resolving civil conflicts in Nigeria. So over to you.
All right, thank you. Firstly, let me apologize for making you pass through this stress. It's actually fought beyond my control. Actually, this presentation is supposed to be delivered by Olajide, but with his permission, I will go ahead with this presentation. Thank you. My name is Olayiwola Ogunpamo. I'm a PhD student at the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, and also I'm a researcher. Presently, I'm not in Nigeria. I'm out of the country, and I'm presently on leave. So that is why I'm not in Nigeria. I'm presently in the UK. Now, I'm here to present the role of Nigerians diaspora in potentially maintaining peace in Nigeria. Introduction. We have subdivided this presentation into 4 categories. We'll be talking about what diaspora is all about. We'll be talking about the exact conflict. We'll be talking about the roles of Nigerians, diaspora Nigerians in bringing peace to Nigeria, and some of the challenges that Nigerians in the diaspora are facing in ensuring that this peace is achieved. Introduction, diaspora. Many people have given definitions of diaspora, what diaspora is all about. But the one that we find relevant for this presentation is the one by Shadman et al. 2014, who described diaspora as the communities of individuals residing and working outside their countries of origins. These individuals often maintain social, financial, cultural connections to their country of origin, usually mediated through family and friends in their homeland. Nigerians remain one of the largest immigrant population all over the world, and this has significantly affected their country of residence and their country of birth, which is Nigeria. Immigrants, these people migrating from Nigeria to other parts of the countries, the reason why Nigerians migrate from their country of origin to other part of the country is not far-fetched. This is in search of greener pasture, a better life, and etc. The post-independence era witnessed various socio-political crises like the Biafra Civil War of 1967, a war between the Nigerian state and the Igbos, one of the major tribes in Nigeria who wished to secede and form an independent country of their own. The war, which lasted for 36 months, led to the death of more than 2 million citizens and the nation's destruction of properties. Another critical point of the pre-independence era was the termination of democratic governance by military dictatorship in the 1980s, which was occasioned by various bloody coups and counter-coups that threw the country into crisis. Nigeria's socio-economic status became so poor and results in the collapse of various sectors of the economy. Despite the socio-economic instability, Nigerians in diaspora has continued to excel and feature prominently in social and economic stability. An intrinsic feature of most Nigerians, especially those in the diaspora, is the strong desire to succeed driven by civility and quest for education. In 2016, Nigeria was ranked the 5th country in the world with the highest number of students foreign study. That is according to Olajide et al. 2018. In the United States, 61% of the population of Nigerians have at least a bachelor degree. Lack of opportunities and brain drain phenomenon has made the UK and Europe accommodate numerous best brains of Nigerian origin in critical sectors of the economy, including health, information technology, financial, and other aspects. Conflicts in Nigeria. Like I'm sharing this, basically North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, India, and other parts of the continent are places that Nigerians migrate to. And report Olajide et al. 2017 also has it that over 2.3 million of Nigerians are presently in the Europe trying to search for one greener pasture or the other. The conflicts in Nigeria and why people migrate. Various issues surround the emergence of conflict in Nigeria, and hence various types of conflicts and their peculiar approach in resolving them. At the moment, the farmer-herder conflict is the most alarming of all conflicts in Nigeria, which has resulted in the loss of many lives, properties, and threatened the peaceful coexistence of Nigerian people. The preoccupation of the domineering Hausa Fulani tribe of northern Nigeria is cattle rearing, but with an unfortunate geographical location, which falls in the arid region, in contrast to the tropical climates and savanna of the south, whose preoccupation is farming and a climate that guarantees a no year-round availability of grasses on which cattle are fed on. These crises, these conflicts, borders on territorial dominance, and some of these crises are related to religion. The search for grass feedstuffs for the survival of nomadic cattle down south was resulted in unlawful and indiscriminate encroachment of farmlands by nomadic Hausa Fulani herdsmen who destroy commercial farms with reckless abandon and hence pose a great economic loss to the farmers. This, out of anger and frustration, has led to various attacks and reprisals between the two parties. Unfortunately, this conflict has generated into ethnic conflict along clannish divide, threatening the oneness and survival of the country. Local, state, and federal government has not been able to address this ugly scenario and the worsening situation, which has led to the springing up of various ethno-militia groups, self-acclaimed activists, and individuals. Another form of conflict, bedeviling Nigerian religious conflict, which usually ensue as a result of religious intolerance and difference in religious beliefs of the various religions existing in Nigeria. Christians, Muslims, and traditional worshippers and other religions usually disagree on conflicting issues relating to their religious beliefs and many other conflicts that Nigeria is presently witnessing. The roles of Nigerians in the diaspora. The roles of Nigeria according to Nelson Mandela, the Nobel Prize Peace winner, says all conflicts, no matter how intractable, are capable of peaceful resolution. It is important to state that the contribution of diaspora groups, it is important to state that the contribution of diasporic groups to home countries in terms of peace and all conflicts can be negative or positive. Most academic work has concentrated more on the economic significance of the diaspora communities in terms of remittances sent to home or families and support, while leaving out aspects of strengthening peaceful coexistence of motherland. The Nigerian diaspora has constant links to their homeland and their inputs, if channeled through formal processes and institutional frameworks, could lead to breakthroughs in areas where Western prescribed conflict resolution concepts have failed. And this has led to a temporary ceasefire. Also, the peculiarity of the Nigerian diaspora is that it dwells more on the concept of citizenship, which places rights over obligations, passive entitlement, and assertion of public interest over any other interest. The engagement of Nigerian diaspora in conflict resolution in the home country is within the framework of transnationalism, which is the process by which immigrants forge and sustain multi-stranded social relations that link together their societies of origin and sentiment. This provides a platform for socio-political engagement, especially in areas where political instability is the major cause of conflict. Lending voice from the diaspora on political matters is constantly putting the key players on their toes, serving as checks and balance in order to maintain peace. As observed on several occasions, most conflicts ensued not because critical issues raised were too complex, but rather because there are no means for proper roundtable discussion, which allows the various parties to hear their views and properly represent their interests. In this instance, I'm glad to say that Nigerians in diaspora have formed different pressure groups, have been able to sustain different scholarships programs to ensure that majority of the rural dwellers now have something to fall back on. For instance, in one of the states, in the southwestern states, Nigerian diaspora have been able to build schools, build hospitals, and ensure that consistently during an electioneering process, they lend their voice into sensitization of citizens, into ensuring that people vote and not engage in violence. This has been the practice for almost 1 decade. It is also important to say that roles of Nigerians in diaspora have been able to sustain the stability of Nigerian economy to an extent. In this regard, according to Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, according to figure from Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, yearly Nigerians diaspora remittances amount to about 25 billion per annum, which actually forms close to 3% to 4% of Nigerian budget. Apart from this, there are various voluntary programs that Nigerian diasporas has ensured towards make sure that Nigerians at home live a peaceful life. The roles of Nigerians in diaspora cannot be overfetched and cannot be overestimated in such a way that people in Nigeria now have confidence that whenever there are issues, they are scared of raising their voices at home. They are now rest assured that people in diaspora can come to their aid. And this has formed very strong alliances between Nigerians in diaspora and the government at all levels. Just recently, one of the Nigerians in diaspora announced that he will be giving scholarship to over 400 indigent students. For people in the diaspora, they see this as great opportunities towards ensuring that Nigerians in diaspora also contribute to the development of them. So in conclusion, without rhetorics, the roles of Nigerians in diaspora has been more positive than negative to the social development of the Nigerian economy as a whole. And this, among other issues, has been able to put on hold and maintain relative peace between the headers, between the farmers and headers clashes. So on this note, I would like to draw the curtain for this presentation, and I hope that I've been able to speak. I hope I've been able to do justice to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Olewole. Thank you. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm a little bit echoey. That's okay. You really seem to talk and link to what Tigist was saying earlier about the sort of accountability aspect of diasporic communities and their role in holding, you describe them as obviously different players, so whether that's the state or other non-state actors to account. So that seems to really chime with some of the things Tigist was saying earlier. And obviously kind of stepping in, it sounds like where where the state is struggling, providing schools and hospitals. So that was fantastic. And also I suppose you touched a little bit on the element of where civic space is potentially restricted in certain conditions, the role that the diaspora may play in shaping that civic space from their more kind of transnational position as well. So I thought that was great. Thank you very much, and thank you for carrying on your own as well. That was great. Thank you, all of you. It's been really fascinating. I've just been scribbling down so many different things and different ideas. So I wanted just to hand over to our discussant, which is Kalpana Wilson. Kalpana's a lecturer in geography at Birkbeck University, and her research explores questions of race, gender, labour, neoliberalism. And I've really enjoyed and been really influenced by Kalpana's work on diasporic engagement, and particularly around DFID, which is the UK, or used to be the UK Department for International Development, and how DFID reproduced kind of racial hierarchies and inequalities through their own promotion of diasporic engagement and development. So it's really great to have you here, and thank you for being here. I know it's been a super busy week for you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, just to echo that, just a really, really interesting set of papers, I think, and thank you for inviting me. And giving me a chance to sort of reflect on them a bit. Mainly just sort of some questions and maybe sharing some things which I sort of related a little bit to my work. I was really interested, Olaiwola, in your what you said about the ways in which diaspora initiatives have been able to kind of replace formal Western conflict resolution initiatives which have failed, and that's something which I would want to hear more about and know about in more detail. What exactly were these initiatives, and how did they work in ways which the earlier ones had been unable to. And also, I suppose, given that this is obviously quite an entrenched conflict, right? The farmer-herder conflict, which you told us about. And this is not something which I, claim to know anything about, so I'm asking you really. But I wondered whether, which of these groups is more present in the diaspora, essentially? Does the conflict kind of reverberate in the diaspora in particular ways? I mean, you've kind of said a lot about how the diaspora has a potential to address it in a much more constructive way. But I mean, I would like to know about, who exactly is the diaspora we're talking about in relation to that conflict. And then later you said how the diaspora has built strong alliances with the government, but presumably that is in fact, I'm coming back to this question repeatedly, but presumably it is particular sections of the diaspora who have that particular alignment, and there are others which don't. And I think, I mean, there's an interesting, coming back to Jen's paper as well, the whole question of the second generation, because, I think there's a kind of assumption that very often for various reasons, the second generation is less engaged with politics back home and so on, or back home in quotes, obviously. I was very struck during this last year's Black Lives Matter movement, that towards September, you had the protests happening in solidarity with the End SARS movement in Nigeria, happening here in London. And you had mainly, a lot of young people with, from Nigerian backgrounds who were participating in those and very much making those connections which are inherent in the Black Lives Matter movement about race and imperialism and the colonial history, and saying, well, Britain is responsible, to such a large extent, not only for the way, they set up the police, and as in so many other ex-colonies, right? They kind of embedded that kind of violence into those institutions. They're still providing training for these, very repressive bodies. There's the role of oil companies, who are kind of basically benefiting from these oppressive structures, transnational companies like Shell and so on. So they were raising all these questions, on the streets of London, which I thought was really, really interesting and made us think again about kind of, and I think that relates to what you've said, but also what Jen talked about in terms of the sort of, in a way, the kind of politicizing of these connections, these connections between diaspora and homeland, not only for those countries, but also here. But I mean, coming back a little bit to Jen's paper and of course some of the questions, the broader questions which Tigis raised at the end, I was kind of thinking about this whole question of, in a way, you talked about, Jen, about liberatory pedagogies, and I mean, I was thinking about sort of anti-imperialist solidarities which the diasporas have historically had in various ways, and you, Jen, I think you use sort of like Black geographies and so on. And I mean, which obviously, has mainly developed in the US. So I was thinking about how those solidarities often, in fact, have gone beyond the specific countries of, heritage. And of course, for the Black diaspora in the US, it has a whole different meaning in any case. It's very different from, first or second generation people who migrated from Africa, completely different. But if we think about, for example, the Black Panthers in the US and the kind of anti-imperialist solidarities that they built, they were both in and beyond Africa. They were with Vietnam, they were with Cuba and so on. And interestingly, in the UK too, we saw that whole history in the sort of anti-racist mobilizations of, an earlier, wave of the longer established communities of, Caribbean and South Asian communities. So for example, Anandi Ramamurthy's book about the Asian youth movements in Britain looks at how they sort of were informed and inspired by various national liberation struggles, which then, in quite similar ways to what you talk about, kind of informed their anti-racist politics in Britain. But they were actually looking at ongoing, sort of making links with ongoing national liberation struggles like South Africa, like Palestine, and so on. I think we need to also think about then, what does it mean when, you're talking about post-colonial countries that in many ways are kind of integrated with, neoliberal global capital, maybe in ways which are not very explicit and which can be accompanied by a lot of rhetoric around, independence and so on, in the way which you said. But it does clearly make a difference. And I wonder what difference that makes to the extent to which this can be transformative for the Rwandan youth that you're working with. I mean, I noticed in the last few days, we've heard Priti Patel making this, this horrendous announcement about the holding camp for refugees to be located in Rwanda. And presumably she couldn't make that statement. I mean, she makes all kinds of statements, but still there is some assumption that there is some kind of level of complicity there from Rwanda. So, I mean, I think those are all things which I thought about. And the last thing I really wanted to say sort of comes back to this whole question, I suppose, more generally of the diaspora as a contested space, which I really feel is so important, you know, that there isn't ever just one diaspora, right? I mean, and I really like Beverly Mulling's work on this, where she looks at Jamaica, and she's kind of very clear about the way it's certain sections of the diaspora who are welcomed by the state, and how they in turn promote and reinforce certain types of policies, which are, in her case, much more sort of putative kind of law and order policies, as opposed to more social policies around kind of social support and so on. And I mean, in my work on India, I mean, you know, there's again coming back to this whole question which Tigis raised about who gets to be called the diaspora, you know, and who doesn't. And I think that's also really key, because like in India, you know, there's the current government, which, you know, is, you know, a far right Hindu nationalist, or I would rather say Hindu supremacist government. But also very much a kind of very much integrated with neoliberal corporate capitalism. You know, it talks a lot about all the support it has from the diaspora, and it certainly, you know, has actually drawn on both the moral and the financial support of the diaspora for its majoritarian projects. And, you know, that's also linked with kind of shifts we see in the UK and in the US particularly, but I particularly have looked at the UK, this kind of shifts in the class position of, you know, of certain Indian communities, particularly, you know, particularly Gujarati, East African communities over time. And there's sort of alignment with this neoliberal project, and also with this Hindu supremacist project. But we're also seeing a lot of contestation around this. So we're seeing now, like, you know, for example, last year, massive demonstrations against sort of exclusive citizenship laws, Islamophobic citizenship laws, and different sections being involved who are not normally recognized as representing the diaspora. So, you know, Dalits, you know, people who are oppressed in caste terms, who have been very organized in Britain, you know, Indian Muslims, you know, left organizations within communities, international students. So I think that's, I mean, I was interested in that in Olaola's point that, you know, what is the role of international students? Sometimes quite, you know, some sections are quite radical, others aren't, and so on. And I think, you know, that kind of question becomes very important, that, like, you know, who is the diaspora and how is that being challenged and contested? Like, you know, that certainly in the Indian context has become a really key question, which people are, you know, reclaiming in a way, that we are also the diaspora and this is not being done in our name. So I think that is really important. I mean, just another point really was the whole thing about you know, the kind of fundraising in emergencies, which Tigis talked about in terms of COVID, you know, and I think that's probably, it's an issue for all diasporas. I mean, when we look at COVID, of course, it comes back to the question, which I think is there in your sort of, Sarah, your write-up for the panel, where, you know, the question of what is the cost as well to those who are contributing, you know, and you know, I know like Anna Lindley's work with the Somali diaspora very much sort of in Britain, very much kind of underlined that there is a cost to people who are already facing, you know, precarity, you know, exploitative employment and all of those things, so that it isn't sort of like always just like a win-win kind of very rosy picture. I mean, with COVID, of course, you're seeing people who are communities in this country who are, you know, very unequally affected by COVID and by that, and then are also have this additional responsibility of kind of of fundraising, of trying to somehow contribute to the fight against COVID, and in the far worse situation, which is, being encountered in context of vaccine inequality and so on in countries of heritage, home countries. So all of that going on, I mean, again, it becomes a question as well of like, who exactly is fundraising for who? In India, we've had recently a huge fundraising attempt, initiative by something called Seva International, which is a very, very, it's basically very, very closely aligned with the Hindu right-wing project, and it's been exposed for fundraising for violence against minorities. But it's again being, like a lot of people, I think, in development circles confuse it with something called the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, which is very different. It's a women's organization. But the SEWA International has been tremendously sort of capitalizing on the crisis in a way to build up particular political forces in India. And, I think then sort of to counter that, you have all kinds of other, lists in circulation about, okay, these are groups who are actually doing work on the ground with people who are marginalized in the context of COVID, who are actually getting oxygen to people, who are organizing ambulances and who are, or who are fundraising for the most, for migrant laborers who've been left without a livelihood in the crisis and so on. And so those things circulate, on the internet and so on, as a way of countering the dominant kind of very well-resourced fundraising drives. So yeah, I think I'm getting a bit specific, so I'm going to stop there, but I just wanted to sort of share some of those things which I think linked to some of the very interesting points which were made in all three papers. So thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And again, I'm just scribbling so much down, so much to think about. I don't know if can I hand it back to the panelists if any of you have got any responses for some of the points that Kalpana raised.
Just a couple of reflections, really. The Kalpana, you mentioned about the moral and the financial kind of aspects to this, and also the sense of belonging and investment, like more emotionally invested kind of things we haven't really raised here. Had been in the case of, for example, the Nigerian environmentalist, when the name slipped my mind, that died a while ago, 2003 or something like that. There was a noise. Yes, thank you. That was, in the diaspora, there was quite a lot of noise around that. So important, it's been really important. And in my own experience, I recall Oxfam did a massive campaign around protest against Starbucks, which was really exploitative to Ethiopian farmers. And that was an important moment and very significant in bringing good change in that kind of dialogue that was happening. The government was having a dialogue out there, but actually it's the diaspora that came at the same time everywhere, in the UK, in Europe, everywhere, went outside of Starbucks to kind of protest and draw attention to the unfair kind of practices that was happening in there. So these are where I see another thing. My observation again is people live in each other's pockets traditionally anyway, because it's not unemployment is so high. You may have one breadwinner, and that income is shared by so many people wherever. And that is the practice the diaspora is bringing with themselves as they are moving abroad. So that is kind of a natural. in a being, you know, it's nothing new in terms of giving back to your community is not anything new. So with that, the you mentioned about they're not giving out of comforts. It's not they're not giving out of their surplus, but actually out of their very little or precarious existence in the UK, for example, in the case you mentioned, the Somalian diaspora community. So these are very interesting. And this, the final comment I would make is again, I really love her comments. I already gave you a quotation. In this one, she appeals to this moral or religion related or something like that. So my advice to fellow diaspora, like Joseph in the Bible, the Africans must give back to their countries. So this is also another narrative around, you know, whether you draw on your religion, whether you draw on your traditional way of living in each other's pockets and support one another, or whether the nationalistic appeal in the politics of side of it, it's all drawing to potential that diaspora could bring.
Thank you, Tigist. That's great. Jen or Oliwola, would you like to add some further reflections just before we close? I think you're just muted, Oliwola. You just take yourself off mute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for everything that have been said. I just want to add to some of the few points I made earlier. And like I started with the presentation, I made it known that, of course, the roles of the Nigerian diaspora has been positive and negative. But the good thing about it is that the positive roles have been more than the negative. Because of the large population of Nigerian immigrants we have all over the world, while some of us are doing exceptionally well, we also have few population who are doing otherwise. And by extension, some people have stereotyped those few who are doing otherwise to represent the whole population. So I want to say that the exposure Nigerians gathered overseas from their own country, whenever they have reasons to return back to Nigeria, that really shows. And I also want to add to it that some of these contributions that the Nigerians in diaspora have been made to Nigeria, there have been structures on ground to checkmate the accountability and to see that the level of corruption is completely checkmated. And how do I mean? Presently, there have been several policies by the Central Bank of Nigeria, whereby when you want to transact financially with Nigeria now, there are different mechanisms in place to ensure that that thing is legal and to ensure that you are not using that to sponsor crisis in Nigeria. So there have been a lot of mechanisms to checkmate excesses of Nigerians in diaspora. So I only want to add to that, so that because when we talk about rules, we must also talk about the accountability. So I feel it is necessary for me to sit down. And while we also consider the positive impact, there's also need for us to look at the negative impact. So the negative impact is just what I have just mentioned. We have few, because of the large immigrant population, we have few who are also behaving negatively in the diasporic communities. I just want to say that should not be used to judge the overall population of Nigerians. So thank you. I think I am okay for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jen, is there anything you'd like to add?
How long have we got, Sarah?
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of leave time at the end. So thank you so much for all of those great things and questions to reflect on, Kalpana. I mean, it's something that I'm still working through myself. Primarily this question of this tension between these kind of engaging with these histories as being liberatory for the diaspora youth in their specific context, which is as historically minoritized, historically marginalized communities in the UK, where engaging with narratives of development, which in Rwanda are, as you rightly said, are built on these, it's built on a kind of narrative of agaciro or dignity, but actually comes with it a specific set of neoliberal prescriptions for achieving it. And in fact, Rwanda deliberately models itself as the Singapore of Africa. That's the goal of Rwanda, is to become the Singapore of Africa. So there's some kind of really interesting things I'm still kind of thinking through there about that kind of mimicry of those development models. But for the people, at least we, and obviously I've got this experience with these very intensive work I've done with these 10 young people, but for them, you know, this is about understanding how they can re-articulate the position in the UK, and how they can kind of reclaim that liberation. And I think as well, the idea of liberation in the Rwandan context means something very, very specific, which is not liberation in terms of sort of liberation from like global colonial structures, but liberation from the particular colonial context in which Rwanda has found itself, and which it found itself with the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and especially the failure of the international community after to help in that situation. And so this was a very you know, it really weighs very heavily on this language of liberation, which is very specific to Rwanda, and it's articulated within a Rwandan context. So, but yeah, and for many, it also kind of mirrors a lot of these debates about volunteering and the white savior complex, because you know, the literature around development volunteering is also polarized between, oh, this is an act of solidarity versus, you know, this is kind of playing into reproducing these kind of divisions between, you know, the white Western volunteers going to like save people who are poorer than them. And for some of our young people, their experience of doing this project has given them particular kind of skills that allow them to position themselves in the neoliberal job market, because then they can add this to their CV, and this is kind of part of them kind of feeling able to like grow in confidence as minoritized young people. So I think it's really one of the things that we're kind of still working through is this the relationality of liberation and how it kind of works within specific geographical contexts and specific embedded positions. But thank you for that. That's a really useful prompt for me to start reflecting on.
Thank you, Jen. I'm conscious of time, and it's nearly 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Thank you so much to everyone for your presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed them. It's given me so much to think about and so much to digest. And Kalpana, thank you so much for your reflections as well. Again, just really stimulating and so much to think about. Yeah, just a big thank you to all of you. Jen and I were hoping originally, or sort of aiming to write maybe a short reflective piece based on this panel, which I think we're still hoping to do, aren't we, Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's nodding. So we'll be in touch with you all about that. And obviously, if you'd like to be involved, we'd like to make it as a collaborative effort. So it'd be great to keep in touch. Yeah, just thank you all so much again. Very much enjoyed the session, and hope to keep in touch and see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of your evenings and weekends.